Night was falling on the small town, casting a sticky, unsettling darkness over the streets. Jamal was returning home after a long day at work. His backpack contained the remains of his lunch and a notebook with sketches of his new painting. Worked part-time at an auto body shop, but dreamed of being an artist. He was only 2 blocks away from home when the red and blue lights of a police car flashed brightly on the corner. He stopped, realizing that this was hardly a good thing. Jamal had seen it in movies, heard it on the news. The police car slowed down, and a tall, fair-skinned officer stepped out. His face was a mixture of weariness and contempt. "Hey, you!" the officer shouted loudly, approaching Jamal. "What are you doing outside at this time of day?" Jamal raised his hands to show that he was not hiding anything and tried to smile. "I'm just going home, sir. I live just around the corner," he said, nodding toward his house. The officers glanced at him, narrowing his eyes. "Yeah, what's in your backpack?" he asked, stepping closer. His voice was cold as steel. "Food and a notebook. I can show you if you want," Jamal replied, taking out his backpack. But the officers raised his hand, stopping his movement. "I know your kind. You wander the streets, pretending to be innocent, but you're hiding something," he said. His words were not only biased, but also filled with a strange, ominous confidence. "Sorry, sir, but I'm not hiding anything," Jamal replied firmly, trying not to show how much his hands were shaking. "You can check." The officers bared his teeth in a grin, and his gaze became even more icy. "Check, of course, I'll check." With that, he abruptly snatched the backpack from Jamal, pulled out a notebook, a container of food, and, after thinking for a second, put his hand in the pocket of his uniform. Jamal did not immediately understand what had happened when the officers pulled out a small plastic bag of white powder and demonstratively threw it back into the backpack. He exclaimed, turning dramatically to Jamal. "That's what I thought. Drugs. You're under arrest." "What?" Jamal's voice rose to a scream. "This is not mine. You put this there yourself." "I did nothing of the sort." But the officers didn't care. He smirked and grabbed Jamal's arm, handcuffing him. "Of course it's not yours," he said sarcastically. "Everyone says that. I'm sure you even have a great story about how you ended up on the streets with drugs." Jamal tried to resist, but he knew that every move against the policeman could cost him his life. A crowd began to gather around. People filmed what was happening on their phones, whispered, but no one dared to intervene. "That's not true. You can't do this," Jamal shouted, his voice breaking with despair. "I was just going home." The officers leaned towards him, so close that Jamal could smell his tobacco. "You're on my block, but," he whispered, "and everything happens the way I say. Remember that." Jamal felt a rage and helplessness building inside him. He looked into the officer's eyes, but he saw no humanity in them. This man enjoyed his power, enjoyed humiliation. As the police car took Jamal away, he saw the faces of the people on the street. Some looked scared, others indifferent, but somewhere in the corner of the crowd, he noticed a woman with a phone in her hand. She was filming everything and whispering, "We won't let him get away with this." This thought was the only ray of light in the pitch darkness of injustice that had consumed his life that night. The police car sped through the night streets, taking Jamal further and further from his home, from the life he was trying to build, from his dream of becoming an artist. His Saturday in the back seat, handcuffs on his wrists, his heart pounding like a hammer. The cop behind the wheel glanced at him from time to time through the rearview mirror, his face twisted into a mocking grin. "Well, artist," the officers asked sarcastically, "is this what you dreamed of? Another street genius who thought he could cheat the system?" Jamal was breathing heavily and his voice was shaking, but he managed to answer. "I didn't do anything. It's not mine. You planted this packet. Why are you doing this?" The officers laughed, his laugh empty and cold. "Planted," he said mockingly. "You know, man, you all say the same thing. Nothing new. It's not my fault. It's all the system. It's all the police. Do you know what the problem is? You are your own problem." Jamal frowned, trying to figure out what he could say or do to change the situation. "You have no right to do this. I am a citizen. I have rights," he said, although he knew how meaningless it sounded. "A license?" the officers asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He turned to Jamal as he stopped the car at a traffic light. "You think you have a license? Maybe that's what they taught you in school. But in the real world, Your license ends where my responsibility begins, and my responsibility is to keep people like you in check. Like me, Jamal gritted his teeth, his voice trembling, but it did not back down. What do you mean, black people? We are not criminals, if that is what you mean. The policeman chuckled, his tone becoming even more sarcastic. Listen, let's call a spade, he said. All most of you do is cause trouble. All this street culture, your parties, drugs, guns. You think we don't see what you're doing, and then you cry foul when you get caught? That's not true, Jamal interrupted, his voice growing louder. I work, I study, I have dreams. I'm not doing anything bad. What makes you think I'm a criminal? The officer was silent for a second, then turned his head, looking at Jamal with disdain. Because you look like one, he said finally, his voice as sharp as a punch. You can put on a suit, you can pretend you're better, but I can see right through you. You're not an artist. You're just another loser who thinks he can move up, but you're staying where you belong. Those words hit Jamal harder than any handcuffs or blows. He felt his heart squeeze with rage and pain, but he could do nothing. It seemed to him that this man was the embodiment of all the hatred and injustice he had faced his entire life. You don't know me, he said quietly, looking into the rearview mirror. His voice was shaking, but there was determination in it. You think you can judge me by my skin alone, but you're wrong. You're the one who's scared. You're scared that the world will change and you'll have to answer for your actions. The policeman slammed on the brakes and the car stopped. He turned to Jamal, his face contorted with anger. Don't you dare tell me that I should be afraid, he shouted. You are in handcuffs now, and I am the one who makes the decisions. And you know what? Your life is over. Neither your dreams nor your words will save you in this system. Jamal was silent. He knew that every word he said only provoked this man, but he knew one thing, the truth was on his side. Even if this night changed his life forever, he would not give up. The police car pulled away, carrying Jamal into the growing darker night. The car was cramped, the air heavy, the silence humming with tension. The policeman drove silently, but he glanced at Jamal from time to time through the rearview mirror, his face stony, but his eyes blazing with contempt. You're sitting quietly. That's right. He finally broke the silence. His voice sounded like a sharp knife cutting through the air. You better get used to it. Wherever you end up, no one will listen to your eat into it. Jamal clenched his fists behind his back, where the handcuffs held them. He took a deep breath, trying not to react to the provocations, but every word the officer said hit his nerves, eating away at his patience. I told the truth, he answered calmly, although his voice was shaking. The drugs were mine. You planted them. Planted? The officers laughed, his laugh rough and mocking. Is that your best defense? You know what's funny? You all say the same thing. It's like you have a manual. I didn't do anything. I'm innocent. You know why that doesn't work? Because I see who you really are, and I don't care what you say. Jamal felt rage boiling inside him, but he knew that any sudden movement, any word spoken in anger, could backfire on him. He looked at the officers, trying to keep his voice level. You want me to be angry. You want me to make a mistake, but I won't let you. You can keep insulting me, but it won't change the fact that I'm right. The officers laughed again, louder this time, almost hysterically. Really? Your truth? He asked, turning his head to look over his shoulder at Jamal. Kid, your truth means nothing. You think anyone's going to believe you. You're just another street kid trying to play the victim. But the system works for people like me. For people like you. It's a cage. The officer's words hit Jamal like stones. He felt his throat tighten. The air getting heavier, but he held on. His father had always told him, don't let them see you weak. And now, at this moment, he clung to those words like a life preserver. A system, Jamal said quietly, his voice hoarse. It's not a system. It's an excuse. An excuse to hate. An excuse to humiliate. You're not defending people. You're defending your right to humiliate us. The officer slammed on the brakes, stopping the car in the middle of the empty road. He turned to Jamal, his face red with anger. What did you say? He said through gritted teeth, his voice a growl. You think you can say that to me? You think I'm going to let you do that? You're nobody. Okay, nobody. And now I'm going to show you what it's like to be nothing. He pulled Jamal out of the car, tugging hard on his arm. The night was cold, and the only light came from the police car's headlights. The officers pushed Jamal against the hood, pressing his face against the cold metal. You want to talk about hate, about the system, he continued, his voice growing louder. You don't understand where you are. Here, you're just trash, and you'll never be more than that. Jamal tried to lift his head, but the officers pressed harder, pinning him down. You can humiliate me, Jamal said, his voice low but determined, but you can't make me believe that I'm nobody, because I know who I am, and that's more than you'll ever understand. The officers paused for a moment, his breathing becoming heavy, but it quickly returned to his arrogant tone. Let's see what you say when they lock you up, he snapped. Your dreams, your truth, they mean nothing when the cell doors close behind you. He pushed Jamal back into the car and slammed the door. The car started moving, and the darkness outside seemed even thicker. But Jamal, despite the fear and pain, felt a small spark inside. It was a spark of hope, a spark that told him, the truth will find a way out, no matter what. The police car pulled into the station yard, its headlights brightly illuminating the gray concrete parking lot. Jamal felt his heart pounding, but his gaze remained steady. He knew that every step he took in this situation would mean more than he did. The policeman got out of his car, opened the back door, and roughly pulled Jamal out. His grip was firm, but it was not so much for his humiliation. He pushed Jamal toward the station door, shouting loudly at the officers on duty. We have another client here, he said with a grin. A violator, a dealer, what an honest lamb. Jamal was led inside the building. The men in uniform cast indifferent glances at him, some of them openly contemptuous. But everything changed when a woman entered the station, the same one who had been filming the events on her phone. She was not alone. There were several people with her, and each of them was holding a phone or tablet. The cameras were aimed at the policeman and Jamal. What's going on here? She asked loudly, her voice sounding like she already knew the answer but wanted everyone to hear it. The policeman turned around sharply, his face contorted with anger. This is a closed area. You can't be here. Leave immediately. We're here to find out the truth, the woman replied, keeping the camera in place. This guy was arrested for no reason. We saw you plant a bag of drugs on him. Nonsense. Or the policeman. You're just looking for something to complain about. Film somewhere else. The woman stepped forward, her eyes shining with determination. This video is already on the internet. Thousands of people saw how you did it. Do you have anything to say in your defense? The policeman seemed to choke with rage. He turned to his colleagues, who began to look at each other, unsure how to react. One of them approached the woman, trying to persuade her to come out. Okay, we'll figure it out, he muttered, but the woman waved him off. We're not here to listen to your promises, she said. We want justice. This guy is innocent. You know it. At this point, the tension reached its peak. The policeman, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, grabbed Jamal by the shoulder and hissed. Do you think these people will save you? Do you think anyone will listen to them and you? You are nothing to them. You are just a story for a day. Tomorrow they will forget about you. But Jamal, despite his fear, did not look away. Maybe, he replied, his voice quiet but firm, but they're here today, and that's enough. One of the policeman's colleagues, who had remained silent all this time, approached him. Listen, he said quietly, but loud enough for them to hear. Can't you just let the guy go? This is too much. The video actually got out online. So what? The policeman barked. Whose side are you on? On the right one, he replied, his voice becoming firmer. We can't afford another scandal. The colleague's words were the final blow. The policeman frowned. His face was twisted with anger, but he knew he was trapped. He let go of Jamal's hand, taking a step back. This isn't over, he hissed, throwing a look full of hatred at Jamal. The woman stepped forward, her voice louder than the policeman's shouts. No, this is just the beginning, and this time no one will escape responsibility. The crowd of people with cameras slowly surrounded the policeman. His armor of confidence cracked like glass under the pressure of the truth. He tried to justify himself, but his words were like a ricochet. They returned to him without reaching their target. Jamal was finally freed from the handcuffs. He stood there, rubbing his wrists, looking at the woman. Her actions were a light in the darkness. She turned to him and said, We won't let them shut us up. You're now alone. For the first time that night, Jamal felt not fear but hope. Hope that this evening would be the beginning of the end of the system that was trying to break him. At the station, despite the presence of cameras and witnesses, the tension was becoming unbearable. The policeman, his face purple with rage and humiliation, was not going to give in. He paced the room like a caged tiger, his eyes flashing lightning. and the words that came out of his mouth were as poisonous as a snake bite. "You think this is the end?" he snapped, turning to Jamal. His voice was like a clap of thunder in the small room. "You think these people, these cameras, will protect you? They just want a sensation. Tomorrow they won't care, and you'll be what you've always been, a loser who always tries to blame others for his failures." Jamal, standing in the corner of the room, felt the officer's words get under his skin, but he forced himself to hold on. He knew that every word he said, every move he made, would be used against him. He looked straight at the officers, his voice firm, even though he was seething inside. "You can say whatever you want," he said, "but the truth is here. People have seen what you did, and you won't be able to hide it this time." These words only seemed to anger the policeman even more. He came closer, stopping a few centimeters away from Jamal. "Really?" he hissed, his face so close Jamal could smell the tobacco and cheap coffee. "The truth is what I say. You're just a petty thief who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and no amount of cameras or witnesses will change what I've decided." "You're afraid," Jamal said quietly, his voice cold and confident. "You're afraid the world will find out who you really are. It's not me who's worthless. It's you, the man who hides behind a badge because without it, you're nothing." The words were like a slap in the face. The policeman frowned for a moment, his face contorted with rage. He took a step forward, but was stopped by the voice of the woman, who was still filming the scene. "Touch him, and it will be your last mistake," she said, her voice as hard as steel. "We all see it, and believe me, every step you take will be recorded." The policeman turned around, his eyes full of hatred. He waved his hand, trying to shoo her away like an annoying fly. "That's not your job," he shouted. "You don't understand how this works. You all come here with your cameras, your slogans, but you don't know what it means to maintain order. These streets are a jungle, and if they're not controlled, people like him will take over everything." The woman didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her camera aimed straight at his face. "Maintain order?" she asked. "This is what you call order? Humiliating the innocent, planting evidence, defending your prejudices. This is not order. This is tyranny, and it ends now." The cop turned back to Jamal, his face tense and his jaw clenched. He seemed to be trying to find new words to break the boy, but now his confidence was beginning to waver. "You can't stand here and smile," he said, his voice rough, "but the system is not on your side. Do you think you can win? You have no idea what I can do. One report from me, and you rot in a cell for years." "Write your report," Jamal replied, looking straight into his eyes. "But it won't change anything, because this time the truth is stronger than your lies." Jamal's words were louder than any scream. The policeman, feeling himself losing control, slammed his fist on the table, his face contorted with anger. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," he shouted. "I'm in charge here, and you're nothing." But his words echoed around the room, finding no support. The other policemen, who had been silent until then, began exchanging glances. One of them, a young officer, finally decided to intervene. "Sir, is that enough?" he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This is too much. This is not what we're here for." The policeman turned to him, his gaze full of hatred. "Are you against me too?" he shouted. "You think you can tell me how to work? It's not work." The young officers replied. It's abuse, and we all see it." The words hung in the air like a bolt from the blue. The cop frowned, his face pale. He knew that control was slipping from his hands, and Jamal, standing in the corner, felt something change. For the first time in that long night, he realized that the system that had tried to break him was itself beginning to crack. The air in the station grew thicker, as if the world itself had slowed down to watch the drama unfold. The cop, out of control, stood at the desk, his fingers clenching and unclenching as if searching for something to vent his rage on. His gaze darted from Jamal, standing nearby, to the woman with the camera, who seemed to be taking in every detail. "You think you can destroy what I spent years building?" he said, addressing Jamal, but his voice was directed at everyone present. "I've seen your kind hundreds of times. You come, you play the victim, you blame me, but I stay, because no one can replace someone like me." Jamal looked straight at him, his face calm but his inside seething. He wanted to shout, to accuse, but he knew that would only increase the tension. Instead, he sat quietly but clearly. "You stay because you're afraid. You're afraid that without your badge, you'll be the one you despise. You talk about the system, but you don't realize that it's breaking right now, and that scares you more than anything else." The words struck like lightning. The policeman turned sharply to the woman with the camera, his eyes shining with rage. "Ew," he hissed, pointing his finger at her. "Turn off your damn camera. You have no right to film here." But the woman didn't flinch. She only clutched the phone tighter in her hands. "I have the right to film everything I see," she replied, her voice firm. "You can keep threatening, but the truth is here, and no one can silence it." The policeman took a step towards her, but another officer's, the same young one who had dared to object earlier, stood in his way. "Sir, that's enough," he said, his voice sounding like he was fighting his own fear. "We can't go on like this. It's getting out of hand." "You too," the senior officers roared, his voice echoing around the room. "You want to side with them. You're willing to betray your own. For what? To appear a hero to these hypocrites." The young officer sighed, then looked at the policeman and said, "This is not a betrayal. This is right. We cannot support this any longer." These words caused a low murmur among the other officers, who were silently watching the scene. The policeman realized that he was losing control not only of the situation, but also of his team. He took a step back, his face turned pale, and his gaze became panicked. "You're all crazy," he muttered, clutching the edge of the table. "It's their fault. These people, they want to destroy everything we've built." At that moment, a man in a formal suit entered the station. His appearance was unexpected but commanding. He looked around the room, lingered his gaze on Jamal, then turned it to the policeman. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low but with authority. The policeman hastened to speak. "This guy was arrested for drugs. He resisted, and these people are preventing us from doing our job." The man in the suit raised his hand to silence him. He then turned to the woman with the camera. "Do you have any records?" he asked. "I have everything I need," she replied, her voice firm. "Every step he takes, every word he says." The man nodded, then turned back to the policeman. "We've received complaints. Your area has been under surveillance for a long time. Did you think you could get away with it? Now it's over." The policeman took a step back, his face turning deathly pale. "This is a mistake," he began, but the man interrupted him. "A mistake?" he asked, his voice turning icy. "Planting drugs is a mistake. Humiliating innocent people is a mistake. No, it's a crime, and now you will answer for it." Jamal, standing in the corner, felt his chest empty. It was the moment when, for the first time in that terrible evening, he realized that truth might win, but he also knew that this was only the first battle. The system that was trying to break him was much bigger than one policeman, and it needed to be torn down to its foundations. The room was deafeningly silent, broken only by the sound of the policeman's heavy breathing, who was now standing at the table, his hands gripping the edge so tightly that his knuckles were white. The man in the suit continued to stare at him, his gaze cold and implacable. No one dared move, and only the woman's camera quietly recorded every moment, every sound, like a mute witness to this battle. "It's all slander," the policeman said, his voice low but still laced with venom. "You're all here just to destroy us. That's part of your plan, isn't it? You want to turn us into targets." "A target?" the man in the suit asked, his voice like hammer blows. "You made yourself a target. With your actions, with your hatred. No one forced you to plant evidence, to humiliate the people you swore to protect. This is your choice, officers." Jamal stood nearby, trying to remain calm, but inside he was a storm. Every look the cop gave him was filled with hatred, as if he blamed Jamal for his world collapsing. And Jamal knew it wasn't his fault. It was a system that had gone unpunished for so long that it was now creaking under its own weight. "Listen," the policeman began, his voice almost pleading now, but still hoarse. "You don't understand what this is like. These streets, these people, we see them every day. They pretend to be innocent, but every single one of them is a threat. We do what we have to do to protect our city." These words caused a murmur among those present. Some of the policemen exchanged glances, some frowned, but no one dared to speak. The woman with the camera took a step forward. "Defense," her voice was sharp, like a blow. "You call humiliating the innocent a defense. You call creating criminals out of thin air a defense. That is not a defense. That is an excuse for your racism." The policeman turned to face her, his face contorted with rage. "You don't know anything," he shouted. "You sit there in your homes and judge us. You don't understand what we see every day. These people, he pointed at Jamal, they will never change. They're just waiting for a chance to stab you in the back. Jamal felt his blood boil. He took a step forward, his voice loud but even. These people, you talk about people as if they were animals. You don't know me. You don't know my life. You only see the color of my skin and decide that's enough to judge me. But I'm more than your hatred, and you know it. These words made the policeman freeze. His face twitched, but he quickly returned to his previous angry look. You're nobody, he said through clenched teeth. You remain nobody, and your words mean nothing. But before he could continue, the man in the suit intervened again. That's enough, he said, his voice drowning out all other sounds in the room. Those words won't change anything anymore. The video and the witness statements are all that's needed. Your voice doesn't matter now, officers. The policeman turned away. His shoulders slumped, but the hatred still pulsated in his eyes. He knew they had lost this battle, but he was not about to admit defeat. Meanwhile, the other police officers began to converse. The atmosphere in the room became increasingly tense. The young officers, who had previously dared to object to his senior, spoke up again. We have to rethink everything that's going on here, he said, his voice unsure but honest. This isn't the first time, and if we continue to ignore it, we'll become part of the problem. His words caused a wave of whispers, but no one dared to openly agree. The woman with the camera turned back to Jamal, her eyes full of determination. You're not alone, she said. We'll fight for you. This night is just the beginning. Jamal nodded, feeling his throat tighten with emotion. He knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. The truth was finally coming to light, and even if the system resisted, it could no longer hide in the shadows. The station fell into an oppressive silence, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The policeman, his confidence beginning to crumble, stood against the wall, his eyes darting around the room. It was not the look of a man ready to admit his mistakes, but the look of a cornered animal, looking for ways to attack again. His hatred was boiling like hot lava, ready to burst forth. The man in the suit standing at the center of the action had the situation under control, but he knew that pressure alone was not enough to break such foundations. The woman with the camera did not take the lens away from the policeman's face, recording his every look, every movement, every grimace of contempt. You want to know what I think? The policeman suddenly spoke, his voice muffled but loud enough to cut through the silence. He looked straight at Jamal, as if he were speaking to him alone. I think this whole game of rights and justice is a farce. You can scream all you want, but your voice will never be heard. People like you will always be at the bottom. People like me will always be at the top. Jamal felt the policeman's words like sharp knives piercing his soul. He clenched his fists, trying not to let his anger take hold. But at that moment, a woman with a camera approached him. Her voice was firm but soft. Don't let him destroy you, she said. His words are his fear. He knows he's losing control, and he's trying to bite you one last time. The policeman heard her and snorted, his face twisting into a grin. Bah, he asked, turning to the woman. You call that fear? No, it's not fear. It's the truth. I see it every day. These neighborhoods, these people, they don't want to change. They'll always be like this, pathetic, lazy, useless. These words made everyone in the room freeze. Even the other officers, who had been silently watching, began to exchange glances. The young officers, who had dared to object to his elder earlier, intervened again. Sir, he began, his voice strained, you've crossed all boundaries. That's not what we stand for. We're here to protect people, not to humiliate them. Protect. The policeman snapped, his voice hoarse. These people, do you really think they deserve protection? They're just waiting for the moment to stab you in the back, and you want to give them that chance. It's not true, Jamal said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. You don't know us. You've never tried. You've built a wall of hatred around yourselves to justify your actions, but that wall is crumbling. Today, you'll see that it no longer protects you. The policeman frowned, his eyes narrowing. These were words he hadn't expected to hear, but instead of falling silent, he stepped closer to Jamal, his voice an ominous whisper. Do you think all this will change anything? Do you think your speeches, your videos will destroy the system? You are a fool if you believe that. It is stronger than you can imagine, and it will always be on our side. But his words no longer sounded so confident. The man in the suit took a step forward. His face was calm, but his voice sounded sharp. "This system is already cracking at the seams," he said, "and you are its face. The face of hatred, discrimination, injustice. But today it ends. We are starting to dismantle it, brick by brick, and you will be the first to answer for your actions." The policeman glanced at his colleagues, but no one supported him. Even those who had looked away before now looked at him with condemnation. He realized that he was alone. His armor, made of power and fear, began to crack, but he still did not give up. "You all don't understand," he said, retreating to the wall. "You're destroying the only thing that keeps this city in order. Without us, there will be chaos here. Chaos is something you created," the woman with the camera replied, "and now you're its victim." At that moment, the men from the Internal Security Department entered the room. They approached the policeman, read him his rights, and handcuffed him. That was the moment when the walls he had spent so long building finally came crashing down. He no longer spoke. He was silent, his face turning gray. Jamal stood to the side, watching. He felt a lump in his throat. It was a victory, but it didn't bring relief. He knew it was only the beginning. The system that was trying to destroy him was deeper and stronger than this one man. But today, he had taken the first step to break it. The policeman, who had just been led out of the station in handcuffs, walked down the hallway with his hat down. His confidence, his mask of infallibility, had been torn away. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, and each of them was full of condemnation. This was a man who had grown accustomed to considering himself part of an untouchable system. But now the system had turned its back on him. His footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, and the silence around him seemed deafening. They put him in an interrogation room. A bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh light on a table and the chairs. He sat there with his hands clasped, his breathing heavy. The policeman couldn't understand how everything could have collapsed so quickly. Everything he knew, everything he relied on, was at risk. He couldn't see a way out, but he still clung to the idea that he could get out of it. The door opened, and the same man in the suit walked in. He was followed by a woman with a camera, who was now holding a tablet. They sat her down in silence, opposite the policeman. For several minutes, no one said a word. The man studied the papers. The woman looked through the notes on the tablet. "Do you understand why you are here?" The man finally broke the silence. His voice was even, but there was a hint of steel in it. "It was a mistake," the policeman said, his voice low and hoarse. "I was just doing my job." "Your job?" the woman asked sarcastically. "Planting evidence, humiliating the innocent, that's your job." "You don't understand," he began, but was interrupted. "No, you don't understand," the man said. His voice grew louder, and every word seemed to grate on the cop's nerves. "You're not hiding behind your badge anymore. You're just a person now. And now you're going to learn what it's like to be truly vulnerable." The man motioned for the woman to show him the tablet. She placed it on the table and started recording. It was a video of Jamal standing next to an older man and woman. They looked worried but firm. "Are these your parents?" the man asked Jamal in the recording. "Yes," Jamal replied, his voice full of dignity. "My father is a lawyer. My mother is a doctor. They always taught me to fight for what is right, even if it is difficult." The policeman tensed, his gaze fixed on the screen, and his breathing became even more ragged. "Now, Mr. Jamal," the man on the recording continued, "tell me why you think this officer was so confident of his impunity." "Because he didn't think I would fight," Jamal said. "But most importantly, he didn't think I had the resources to fight. He didn't know who my parents were." The cop leaned back abruptly. He remembered how he had roughly planted the bag of drugs in Jamal's backpack. At the time, he had seen him as just another guy off the street who would be easily broken. But now he realized that this guy off the street was the son of one of the state's most prominent attorneys and a respected doctor. He realized that all along his adversary had been not only Jamal, but also his family, who had every opportunity to see this through to the end. "This is all nonsense," the policeman muttered, his voice shaking. "This is a setup. You just want to destroy me." "Destroy you?" a woman asked, her voice full of contempt. "You destroyed yourselves. With your actions, your hatred. No one asked you to do what you did, and now you bear the responsibility for it." The man in the suit stood up, his gaze cold. "We know everything," he said. "Your actions are captured on video. Witnesses are ready to testify. But most importantly, your cases will now be reviewed. Every arrest, every case you were involved in will be re-examined, and if they find anything else, you will go to prison for many years. The policeman felt a chill run through his body. He could no longer hide his fear. His career, his life, was crumbling before his eyes. That's not all, the man continued. Jamal's parents have filed a lawsuit against you in the precinct. This case will become a precedent. The system you defended will begin to crumble, and you will be its first stone. The policeman was silent, his Saturday staring at the table, knowing that his world had truly come to an end. And behind the glass of the room, Jamal watched everything, his gaze unwavering. He knew that the truth was finally on his side, but he also knew that there was still a long way to go. Today was only the first step in destroying the system that was trying to destroy him. The policeman Saturday at the table in the interrogation room, his hands, usually tightly gripping his handcuffs and gun, now lay limply on the table. The light from the lamp above his head cast deep shadows around his face, as if the room itself were judging him. The confidence that had always been his armor was now crumbling, giving way to fear that was growing inside him like poison ivy. The door creaked open, and a man in a suit walked in. He was holding a folder in his hands, which he threw on the table in front of the policeman. The papers scattered slightly, and on one of them was a photograph of Jamal's face next to his parents, who looked serious but confident. "Look at this," the man said, his voice as cold as a winter wind. "These are the people who know everything about you now, and this is just the beginning." The policeman looked at the photograph, his face impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was recognition. He looked up at the man. "It's pointless," he said, his voice hoarse. "You all think you're going to break me, but you're not. I was just doing my job." The man leaned closer, his voice quieter, but there was a threat in it. "Work?" he asked. "You call planting drugs on innocent people work? Humiliation, threats, abuse. That's your work. Look around you, officers. You're not behind your badge anymore. You're alone now, and you know it." The policeman's jaw clenched, his hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. He had nothing to say. He knew that anything he said would be used against him. The man in the suit opened the folder and pulled out more papers. He laid them out on the table, and each one contained photographs, documents, testimonies. This was evidence of his past actions. This was his career, exposed and put under a microscope. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," the man said, tapping his finger on the papers. "We've started looking into cases you were involved in. You know what we found: false accusations, evidence that doesn't add up, people who are behind bars because of your actions. Are you scared, officers?" The policeman looked at the papers, then looked back at the man. His gaze was filled with despair, but he was still trying to maintain a cold expression. "None of this proves anything," he said, but his voice was shaking. "You want to make me the scapegoat to cover up your mistakes." The man chuckled, but his smile was devoid of warmth. "A scapegoat," he said, tilting his head slightly. "You put yourself in this position. You thought the system would always protect you, but now you realize it can also turn against you. It wasn't us who made you vulnerable. It was you who destroyed your armor." The policeman felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at the door of the interrogation room, but the way out seemed closed. Suddenly he realized how alone he really was. All his colleagues who had once supported him were now silent. No one tried to protect him. No one even tried to cheer him up. "You don't understand," he began, but the words came out weakly. "These streets, they're tough. If you're not tough on them, you'll lose." "Lose?" The man slapped the table, making the policeman flinch. "You lost when you decided you could play the role of judge, jury, and executioner all at once. You lost when you stopped seeing people as people." These words, like ice needles, pierced the policeman's consciousness. He realized that he could no longer justify himself, but he still tried to resist. "What was I supposed to do?" he cried, his voice breaking. "I see them every day. These people don't want to change. I was just trying to protect order." The man leaned back in his chair, his face becoming stern. "You were trying to protect yourself," he said, "and now you realize you're vulnerable. You're scared because you're no longer protected. Because now the system you used is destroying you." The policeman was silent. His hands began to shake. He looked at the papers, but he couldn't focus. He felt the fear he had been trying to suppress becoming all-consuming. This was the end, and he knew it, but he still couldn't end the defeat. "This is not the end," he muttered, but even he himself did not believe his words. "This is the end for you," the man said, standing up, "but for the system you represented, this is only the beginning of its destruction." The policeman was left sitting alone, realizing that his confidence, his power, his status, all of it was gone. All that was left was fear and emptiness. In the cold holding cell, the silence became unbearable. The policeman, accustomed to noise and control, now found himself isolated. A prisoner of his thoughts, his hands shook and his heart pounded like a trapped animal trying to break free. Muffled sounds of conversation and footsteps could be heard behind the steel doors, but no one came. No one paid attention to him. He was alone, and this thought was slowly driving him crazy. He sank down on the hard bench in the corner of the cell, clasping his hands in front of him. His breathing was getting heavier. He tried to convince himself that this was temporary, that someone would come along, someone would stand up for him. But deep down, he knew this was the end. The system he had used for so long had now turned its back on him. He was useless, an outcast, a broken cog in a machine he had thought invincible. The cell door clanged open. A man in a formal suit walked in. 2 internal security officers followed him. The policeman raised his head, a faint hope in his eyes, but the expression on the faces of those who entered quickly destroyed it. "Officer," the man began, his voice cold but with unwavering confidence, "we have completed our preliminary investigation. You have numerous charges, but most importantly, we have found that your actions have harmed dozens of innocent people." The policeman swallowed hard, his voice sounding hoarse. I was just doing my job. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." The man leaned towards him, his eyes flashing. "You weren't just doing your job. You abused your power. You destroyed lives. And now your life is your responsibility. The system you used no longer protects you." The policeman tried to justify himself, but his words caught in his throat. He realized that every word only increased his guilt. He could no longer hide behind a badge or a rank. His fear became all-consuming. The man pulled out a few more documents from the folder and threw them on the table. "We have reviewed all your cases. Each of them will be reopened. The people you accused will receive justice. It will be a long process, but it begins today." The policeman felt a chill run through his body. He knew that now his every action would be examined under a microscope, and there was nothing he could do about it. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Jamal and his family sat at a round table with a group of lawyers and activists. These were the people who had decided to make this case the beginning of global change. Jamal, despite his fatigue, felt relief. He looked at his parents, at those who had supported him, and he knew truth had prevailed. One of the lawyers stood up. "This case will set a precedent," he said. "We will not only prove Jamal's innocence, but we will also create a basis for reform in the system. This is just the beginning." Jamal nodded, his voice calm but firm. "We have to make sure that this never happens again, so that no one has to go through what I had to go through." Meanwhile, the policeman was led out of the cell. He walked down the hallway with his head down, feeling the judgmental gazes on him. His confidence had evaporated, leaving only a shadow of who he once was. It felt like the walls of the hallway were closing in, pressing down on him, turning him into a prisoner even before the doors had slammed shut. But that was only the beginning of his isolation. The world outside had changed. People were no longer afraid to speak the truth. Jamal and his story became a symbol of the possibility of justice, that even the most unshakable system can crumble if its foundation is built on hatred and prejudice. The policeman got into the car that was supposed to take him to the detention center. He looked out the window, but saw nothing but his own reflection. This was a man who was used to seeing himself as strong, and now he could not face himself. The truth had caught up with him, and now he knew there was no escape from it. Friends, this story is a reminder of how important it is to stand up for the truth and fight for justice, even in the most difficult circumstances. Do you think the world can be a better place if we talk openly about such issues? Have you ever experienced racism or unfair treatment in your life? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments. Your voice matters, and we want to hear from you. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Your comments and support give us the strength to tell stories like this that touch everyone. If you like this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it. It really means a lot to us. Have a wonderful day filled with kindness and justice. Remember, together we can make the world a better place.